Ethan Walker was a man who had everything: wealth, success, and a luxurious mansion that stood like a symbol of his achievements. At just 30 years old, he had built an empire, running a chain of successful businesses that made him one of the most influential figures in the city. Yet despite his accomplishments, his life felt empty. He lived alone in his grand estate, a place filled with expensive furniture, rare paintings, and sparkling chandeliers, but none of it gave him true happiness. He had no close family left. His parents had passed away years ago, leaving behind their wealth but no warmth. Ethan had spent most of his life working, thinking that success would bring fulfillment, but lately he had started to feel the weight of loneliness pressing on him. He had never cared for love or relationships before. Women had come and gone in his life, most of them drawn to his money, but none had ever touched his heart. He believed love was just an illusion, something people desired but never truly found. One morning, while he was sipping his black coffee and reading the newspaper, his housekeeper, Mrs. Harris, entered the dining room. She was an elderly woman who had been working in his house for many years. She was one of the few people he trusted. "Sir, I have hired a new maid," Mrs. Harris announced, her voice steady and professional. Ethan barely looked up from his newspaper. "All right," he said simply. "Her name is Bella. She is young but hardworking," Mrs. Harris continued. "I believe she will be a good addition to the house staff." Ethan gave a small nod. He had no interest in the household workers. As long as they did their job well, he had no reason to interfere. Later that day, as he was walking through the hallway, he noticed someone in the living room, dusting the shelves. It was a young woman, dressed in a simple uniform. Her long dark hair was tied back in a low ponytail, and she moved gracefully as she worked. Something about her presence caught his attention. Ethan didn't realize he was staring until she turned around. Their eyes met for the first time. She had deep brown eyes, soft yet strong, and for a moment, Ethan felt an unfamiliar sensation in his chest. He had seen many beautiful women before, but there was something different about her. There was no arrogance in her expression, no artificial charm. She looked surprised to see him, and quickly lowered her gaze, as if afraid to make eye contact. "Good afternoon, sir," she said politely, her voice soft but firm. Ethan cleared his throat, realizing he had been silent for too long. "You're the new maid?" "Yes, sir." "My name is Bella," she answered, keeping her hands folded in front of her. "All right, carry on," he said before walking away. But even as he left the room, his mind lingered on her face, her voice, and the way she carried herself with quiet dignity. Over the next few days, Ethan found himself noticing Bella more often. She worked efficiently, never wasting time, never complaining. Unlike some of the other servants, she never gossiped, never tried to seek attention. She was different. He couldn't explain why, but he was drawn to her presence. One evening, he passed by the kitchen and saw her standing by the window, looking outside. She wasn't working at that moment. She was simply watching the sky, lost in thought. There was something peaceful yet sad about the way she stood there, as if she carried a world of emotions inside her but never spoke of them. Ethan found himself hesitating before walking away. He told himself he was only curious. That was all. But deep down, a part of him knew something had changed. He had never cared about any of his servants before, but Bella was different, and no matter how much he tried to ignore it, he couldn't deny the truth. He wanted to know more about her. Days passed, but Ethan couldn't ignore the presence of Bella in his home. At first, he told himself it was just curiosity. She was different from the other maids, quiet, hardworking, and never looking for attention. She never spoke unless necessary, never tried to impress anyone, and always carried herself with quiet grace. There was something about her that made him want to watch her, even when he knew he shouldn't. Ethan found himself noticing the small things about her. The way she tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear when she was working. The way she carefully arranged the flowers in the vase, as if each petal mattered. The way she moved around the house without making a sound, her presence calm and peaceful. He had never paid attention to a servant before, but with Bella, it was different. He didn't understand why. One afternoon, he sat in his study, pretending to focus on his work, but his mind wandered. He thought about the way she had looked at him that first day, her eyes filled with surprise, but also something else: respect. Unlike the women he had known in the past, she didn't try to flirt with him, didn't try to get his attention. She simply did her job, as if he were just another person. That was new to him. Most people treated him with either admiration or fear, but Bella treated him like he was no different from anyone else. It was evening when Ethan finally decided to take a walk in the garden. It was something he did often to clear his mind. The night air was cool, and the scent of fresh flowers filled the air. As he walked along the stone path, he noticed a figure sitting quietly on the wooden bench under a tree. Bella. She hadn't seen him yet. She was sitting still, looking up at the sky, her hands resting on her lap. For the first time, Ethan saw her in a different light. Not as a servant, not as someone working for him, but as a woman lost in her own thoughts. He hesitated for a moment before stepping closer. "You like flowers?" he asked. Bella gasped softly and turned to look at him. She seemed surprised to see him standing there. For a moment, she hesitated as if unsure whether to answer. "Yes, sir," she finally said, her voice soft. Ethan smiled slightly. "You don't have to call me sir, just call me Ethan." Bella's eyes widened a little, and she looked down, as if uncomfortable. I'm not sure if that would be appropriate." Ethan chuckled. "And why not?" "Because you are my employer," she said simply. Her honesty amused him, but it also made him more curious about her. He sat down on the bench next to her, keeping some distance between them. "Tell me, Bella," he said, his voice calmer now. "Why did you take this job?" She hesitated again before answering. "I needed work," she said simply. Ethan nodded, waiting for her to continue. After a long pause, she finally spoke again. "I grew up in an orphanage. When I turned 18, I had to leave and find a way to survive. I took whatever jobs I could find. Housekeeping was one of them. Mrs. Harris was kind enough to hire me." Ethan listened carefully. He had never thought about the lives of his servants before. He had always assumed they had families, homes to return to. But Bella had no one. She had built her life from nothing, yet she carried no bitterness, no complaints. "You must be strong," he said after a moment. Bella gave a small smile, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. "I do what I have to do," she replied. Ethan didn't know why, but he felt something stir inside him. Respect, admiration, maybe even something deeper. He had met many women before, women who wanted luxury, who cared about money and power. But Bella was different. She had nothing, yet she carried herself with dignity. For a moment, they sat in silence. The only sound was the gentle rustling of the leaves in the night breeze. Then Bella stood up. "I should go. I have work to finish." Ethan wanted to stop her, to talk to her more, but he only nodded. "Good night, Bella." She looked at him for a second before lowering her gaze. "Good night, Ethan." As she walked away, Ethan realized something strange. He couldn't stop thinking about her. And for the first time in a long time, he felt something real. Something dangerous. Something he couldn't ignore. Ethan tried to push Bella out of his mind, but it was impossible. Every day he found himself watching her, noticing her small gestures, her quiet beauty, and the way she carried herself with grace despite her simple position in his home. It wasn't just her appearance that intrigued him, it was something deeper. She wasn't like the women he had met before. She didn't chase luxury, didn't try to impress him, didn't seek his attention. And yet, without trying, she had captured his. At first he told himself it was just curiosity. He was used to being in control of his emotions, of his life. But Bella made him feel something unexpected, something he wasn't sure he could fight. One morning, Ethan sat in the dining room, drinking his coffee, when he saw Bella passing by, carrying a basket of laundry. She didn't look at him, didn't acknowledge his presence, but he found himself watching the way she moved, with quiet efficiency and purpose. He had never paid attention to a servant before. But with Bella, everything was different. Later that day, he found her in the library, dusting the shelves. The sunlight from the window made her skin glow softly, and for a moment he simply stood there, watching her. "Bella," he finally said. She turned, startled. "Yes, sir." "I told you not to call me that," he reminded her. She hesitated. "Ethan," she corrected herself, her voice barely above a whisper. He took a step closer. "You've been working here for a while now. I hardly know anything about you." Bella looked down, avoiding his gaze. "There's nothing much to know," she said simply. "I don't believe that," Ethan said, his voice softer now. "You're different." Bella's hands tightened around the cloth she was holding. I am just a maid, she said firmly, nothing more. Ethan wanted to argue, but he could see she was uncomfortable, so he stepped back. All right, he said, his voice calm. I won't push. But if you ever want to talk, I'm here. Bella nodded quickly before turning back to her work. But as Ethan left the room, he knew one thing for certain: he was falling for her. And there was nothing he could do to stop it. That evening, Ethan stepped out into the garden for some fresh air. To his surprise, he saw Bella sitting on the grass, looking up at the sky. She didn't notice him at first, and he took a moment to watch her. She looked peaceful, yet there was a sadness in her expression that made his heart tighten. He walked toward her slowly. Do you always sit here alone? Bella jumped slightly and turned to him. She looked like she wanted to stand up, but Ethan gestured for her to stay. It's quiet here, she said softly. Ethan nodded and sat down beside her, keeping a respectful distance. What do you think about when you look at the stars? He asked. Bella hesitated, then said that the world is big, and I am small. Ethan looked at her, surprised by her words. You don't seem small to me, he said. Bella gave a soft smile but didn't reply. They sat in silence for a while, the cool night air surrounding them. Ethan had never done this before, just sitting with someone, enjoying the quiet. It felt peaceful. Then suddenly, a loud clap of thunder rumbled through the sky. Bella gasped as raindrops began to fall. We should go inside, Ethan said, standing up. But before Bella could move, she slipped on the wet grass. Ethan reacted instantly, reaching out and catching her just in time. Their faces were close, their bodies pressed together for a moment. His heart pounded in his chest as he looked into her eyes. Bella's breath hitched, and she quickly stepped back, pulling away from his hold. I should go, she whispered, her voice shaky. Ethan didn't stop her. He watched as she hurried inside, her figure disappearing into the mansion. He stood there in the rain for a long time, feeling something he had never felt before. He was falling in love, and it terrified him. Ethan tried to push Bella out of his mind, but it was impossible. Every day he found himself watching her, noticing her small gestures, her quiet beauty, and the way she carried herself with grace despite her simple position in his home. It wasn't just her appearance that intrigued him, it was something deeper. She wasn't like the women he had met before. She didn't chase luxury, didn't try to impress him, didn't seek his attention, and yet, without trying, she'd captured his. At first he told himself it was just curiosity. He was used to being in control of his emotions, of his life. But Bella made him feel something unexpected, something he wasn't sure he could fight. One morning, Ethan sat in the dining room, drinking his coffee, when he saw Bella passing by carrying a basket of laundry. She didn't look at him, didn't acknowledge his presence, but he found himself watching the way she moved, with quiet efficiency and purpose. He had never paid attention to a servant before. But with Bella, everything was different. Later that day, he found her in the library, dusting the shelves. The sunlight from the window made her skin glow softly, and for a moment he simply stood there watching her. Bella, he finally said. She turned, startled. Yes, sir. I told you not to call me that, he reminded her. She hesitated. Ethan, she corrected herself, her voice barely above a whisper. He took a step closer. You've been working here for a while now. I hardly know anything about you. Bella looked down, avoiding his gaze. There's nothing much to know, she said simply. I don't believe that, Ethan said, his voice softer now. You're different. Bella's hands tightened around the cloth she was holding. I am just a maid, she said firmly. Nothing more. Ethan wanted to argue, but he could see she was uncomfortable, so he stepped back. All right, he said, his voice calm. I won't push, but if you ever want to talk, I'm here. Bella nodded quickly before turning back to her work. But as Ethan left the room, he knew one thing for certain: he was falling for her. And there was nothing he could do to stop it. That evening, Ethan stepped out into the garden for some fresh air. To his surprise, he saw Bella sitting on the grass, looking up at the sky. She didn't notice him at first, and he took a moment to watch her. She looked peaceful, yet there was a sadness in her expression that made his heart tighten. He walked toward her slowly. You always sit here alone? Bella jumped slightly and turned to him. She looked like she wanted to stand up, but Ethan gestured for her to stay. It's quiet here, she said softly. Ethan nodded and sat down beside her, keeping a respectful distance. "What do you think about when you look at the stars?" he asked. Bella hesitated, then said that the world is big, and I am small. Ethan looked at her, surprised by her words. "You don't seem small to me," he said. Bella gave a soft smile but didn't reply. They sat in silence for a while, the cool night air surrounding them. Ethan had never done this before, just sitting with someone, enjoying the quiet. It felt peaceful. Then suddenly, a loud clap of thunder rumbled through the sky. Bella gasped as raindrops began to fall. "We should go inside," Ethan said, standing up. But before Bella could move, she slipped on the wet grass. Ethan reacted instantly, reaching out and catching her just in time. Their faces were close, their bodies pressed together for a moment. His heart pounded in his chest as he looked into her eyes. Bella's breath hitched, and she quickly stepped back, pulling away from his hold. I should go," she whispered, her voice shaky. Ethan didn't stop her. He watched as she hurried inside, her figure disappearing into the mansion. He stood there in the rain for a long time, feeling something he had never felt before. He was falling in love, and it terrified him. Ethan had never been the kind of man to chase after something or someone. He was used to getting what he wanted without effort. But Bella was different. She wasn't something he could win with wealth or power. She was someone he had to earn. Days passed, but Bella still avoided him. She spoke only when necessary, kept her distance, and never met his eyes for more than a second. It drove him mad. She had feelings for him. He was certain of it. He had seen the way she looked at him in that moment before she ran away, but something held her back. Ethan wasn't used to being ignored. He had never cared about the opinions of others before, but for the first time he realized how much Bella's silence hurt him. It was as if she had built a wall between them, and no matter what he did, he couldn't break through. One evening, as he stood by the window of his study, staring out into the dark garden, Mrs. Harris entered the room. She had been the housekeeper for years, and she knew Ethan better than most people. "She's a special girl," Mrs. Harris said suddenly. Ethan turned to her, surprised. "What?" "Bella," she said with a knowing look. "She's different from the others. I see the way you look at her." Ethan sighed and ran a hand through his hair. "And yet, she won't even talk to me anymore." Mrs. Harris smiled gently. "She's scared." "Of me?" he asked, frowning. "Not just you," Mrs. Harris said. "Of what being with you would mean. She's a servant, Ethan. You're a wealthy man. People will talk. They'll judge her. Maybe even humiliate her. Have you thought about that?" Ethan clenched his jaw. Of course, he had thought about it. Society was cruel, and a man like him falling for a woman like Bella would create a scandal. But he didn't care. All he cared about was her. "I won't let anyone hurt her," he said firmly. Mrs. Harris sighed. "Then you need to make her believe that." Ethan thought about those words for a long time. The next day he made a decision. If Bella wouldn't talk to him, he would find a way to show her how serious he was. That evening, as the house grew quiet and most of the staff had gone to their rooms, Ethan waited. He knew Bella would be finishing her work soon. He had noticed her routine. She always checked the kitchen last before retiring to her small room. When he saw her finally leaving the kitchen, he stepped forward. "Bella." She froze, gripping the cloth in her hands. She didn't turn to look at him. "It's late, Ethan," she said quietly. "I know," he said, taking a step closer, "but I can't keep pretending that I don't care about you." Bella sighed but still didn't turn around. "You should pretend," she whispered. "It will make things easier." Ethan reached out and gently touched her arm. "For whom?" She stiffened but didn't pull away. He took that as a sign to continue. "I know you feel the same way," he said softly. "I saw it in your eyes that night in the garden, and I know you're scared, but I promise you, I would never let anyone hurt you." Bella slowly turned to face him. Her eyes were filled with pain, with longing, with hesitation. "You say that now," she said. "But what happens when people start whispering? When they say I'd only wanted your money? When they call me names? Will you still look at me the same way?" Ethan didn't hesitate. "Yes," he said firmly. "Because I don't care about them. I care about you." Bella swallowed hard, her hands tightening into fists. "Ethan, I..." Before she could finish, Ethan reached for her hand. He held it gently, his thumb brushing over her skin. "I have never wanted anything more in my life," he whispered. "But I won't force you. I just need to know. Do you feel the same way?" Bella's lips parted as if she wanted to deny it, but she couldn't. Not this time. Tears welled in her eyes as she nodded, barely whispering, yes. Ethan exhaled in relief, a small smile touching his lips, but before he could say anything, Bella pulled her hand away. But it doesn't change anything, she said quickly. This can't happen. Ethan's heart dropped. Why? Bella looked at him, her eyes filled with a mix of love and sorrow, because love isn't always enough. And with that she turned and walked away, leaving Ethan standing there, more determined than ever to prove her wrong. Ethan couldn't sleep that night. Bella's words echoed in his mind, love isn't always enough. He had never felt so frustrated, so helpless. He had spent his life solving problems with money, power, and influence. But none of those things could change Bella's heart. She loved him. He had seen it in her eyes, heard it in her trembling voice when she finally admitted it, and yet she was still pushing him away. Why? The next morning, Ethan was more determined than ever. If Bella thought their love wasn't enough, then he would prove her wrong. He found her in the garden, tending to the flowers as she always did in the early hours. She didn't notice him at first. The sunlight touched her face, making her look even more beautiful, and for a moment, Ethan just watched her. Then he spoke. Are you planning to avoid me forever? Bella stiffened but didn't turn around. I have work to do, Ethan. I don't care about your work, he said, stepping closer. I care about you. Bella sighed and set down the watering can. Please, don't make this harder than it already is. Ethan took another step forward. Then tell me why, he demanded. Tell me why we can't be together when we both know how we feel. Bella finally turned to him, her eyes filled with sadness. Because I don't belong in your world. Ethan frowned. Who decides that? Society? Gossiping strangers? Bella nodded. Yes, people talk, Ethan, they always do. And a woman like me, being with a man like you, they'll never accept it. They'll think I'm trying to take advantage of you. They'll say I don't deserve you. Ethan's jaw tightened. I don't care what they say. But I do, Bella whispered. You've never had to prove yourself to anyone, but I have. My whole life, I've had to work for respect, for dignity. I won't let people take that away from me just because I dared to love someone above my status. Ethan stared at her, his heart aching. So you'd rather be miserable? Push me away because of them. Bella's eyes glistened with unshed tears. I'd rather not lose myself, she whispered. Ethan exhaled slowly. He could see the pain in her eyes, the war she was fighting within herself. He wanted to argue, to convince her that she was worth more than the opinions of others. But he realized something in that moment. Bella wasn't just afraid of society, she was afraid of being hurt, and that was something he couldn't force her to overcome. So he did something he had never done before. He let her go. If that's what you truly believe, he said, his voice quieter now, then I won't force you to stay in my life. Bella's breath hitched, and for a moment, she looked like she wanted to take back her words. But she didn't. Instead, she whispered, thank you. Ethan turned away before he could change his mind, before he could beg her to stay. He walked back into the house, leaving Bella standing alone in the garden. For the next few days, Ethan threw himself into work, trying to drown out the ache in his heart. He was restless, frustrated, and for the first time, truly lonely. Nothing felt the same anymore. The house felt empty without Bella's quiet presence. Meals felt tasteless. Nights stretched on endlessly. He told himself that he had done the right thing by letting her go, by respecting her choice. But deep down he knew one thing: he needed her. And he had to find a way to make her see that they were meant to be together. Then, one afternoon, Ethan overheard a conversation between two of the housemaids. Did you hear? One whispered. Bella's leaving. Ethan's entire body froze. What? The other maid asked. She gave her notice. She said she's going to work at another house in the city. Ethan didn't wait to hear the rest. He turned on his heel and stormed through the halls, searching for her. He found Bella in her small room, packing her few belongings into a worn-out bag. She gasped when she saw him at the door. You're leaving? He demanded. Bella lowered her gaze. It's for the best, Ethan. Ethan took a deep breath, forcing himself to stay calm. Running away won't change how we feel. Bella's hands trembled as she held onto her bag. It will help me forget. Ethan stepped closer, his voice firm but gentle. And is that what you really want, to forget me? Bella squeezed her eyes shut, as if fighting back tears. It doesn't matter what I want. Yes, it does, Ethan insisted. Bella, I love you. And I know you love me too. But love isn't about running away, it's about fighting for what matters. Bella finally looked up at him, her eyes filled with pain. And what if I fight and still lose? Ethan reached out and cupped her face in his hands. Then I'll fight with you, he whispered, for as long as it takes. Bella's breath shuddered as a tear slipped down her cheek. Ethan wiped it away gently, his touch soft, his eyes pleading. Stay, he whispered. Stay with me. Bella stood frozen, her heart pounding wildly in her chest. Ethan's hands were warm against her skin, his gaze intense, filled with emotion she had never dared to hope for. Stay, he whispered again, his voice softer this time, as if afraid that pressing too hard would scare her away. Her throat felt tight, her mind torn between logic and desire. She had spent so long convincing herself that being with him was impossible that she had never stopped to think. What if it wasn't? What if it doesn't work? She whispered, her voice barely audible. Ethan smiled, his thumb brushing over her cheek. Then we figure it out together. Bella's breath caught. She had expected him to make promises of a perfect life, to tell her that love would magically solve everything, but he didn't. Instead, he told her the truth. That love wasn't easy, that it required effort, trust, and a willingness to fight for it. And for the first time, she wanted to believe in it. Slowly, cautiously, she placed her hands over his. I'm scared, she admitted. Ethan leaned closer, resting his forehead against hers. So am I, he murmured. But I'd rather be scared with you than live without you. A shaky breath left her lips. I don't know how to be with you. Ethan smiled. Then we'll learn together. Bella closed her eyes, feeling the warmth of his presence, the steady rhythm of his breathing. Could she really do this? Could she let herself love him, despite everything? She thought about the loneliness she had felt every time she pushed him away, the ache in her heart when she convinced herself she wasn't worthy of him. And then she thought about what it felt like to be in his arms, to hear him say her name with such tenderness, to know that someone like him had chosen her. When she opened her eyes, Ethan was still there waiting. Okay, she whispered. I'll stay. Ethan exhaled sharply, as if he had been holding his breath. Then, before she could say another word, he pulled her into his arms, holding her so tightly she felt as though she might disappear into him. Bella melted into the embrace, feeling the steady beat of his heart against her own. It felt right. He felt right. Ethan pulled back just enough to look at her, his blue eyes searching hers. Are you sure? Bella nodded, a small, genuine smile forming on her lips. Yes. A slow grin spread across his face. Then, without hesitation, he leaned in and kissed her. The moment their lips met, Bella felt her entire world shift. It was soft at first, hesitant, as if Ethan was still giving her a chance to pull away. But she didn't. Instead, she reached up, wrapping her arms around his neck, pressing closer. Ethan responded instantly, deepening the kiss, pouring all of his emotions into it, his longing, his relief, his love. It was a kiss that spoke of all the words they had never said, all the emotions they had tried to deny. When they finally pulled apart, breathless, Ethan rested his forehead against hers once more. I love you, he murmured. Bella's heart swelled at his words. She had been afraid of this love for so long, afraid of what it would mean, of how it could change her life. But standing here, in his arms, she realized she didn't want to run anymore. I love you too, she whispered. Ethan smiled, pressing a gentle kiss to her forehead. Then that's all that matters. In the days that followed, Bella learned what it meant to love someone like Ethan. It wasn't easy, there were still whispers among the staff, still lingering fears in the back of her mind. But every time doubt crept in, Ethan was there, steady and unwavering, reminding her why they were doing this. He didn't try to change her. He didn't try to make her into something she wasn't. Instead, he made space for her in his life, showing her that she belonged, not because of her status, but because of who she was. And Bella, for the first time in her life, allowed herself to be loved. One evening, as they walked through the garden, Ethan took her hand and laced their fingers together. What are you thinking? He asked, watching her with that familiar intensity. Bella smiled, squeezing his hand. That I'm glad I stayed. Ethan chuckled. Good, because I wasn't going to let you go that easily. She laughed softly, leaning into the side. I should have known. Ethan tilted her chin up, looking at her with a mixture of love and determination. Bella, I want you to know something. What? She asked. He took a deep breath. I don't just want you in my life, I want us. A future. Together. Bella's heart skipped a beat. Are you sure? She whispered. Even after everything? Ethan smiled. Especially after everything. Bella exhaled, realizing that for once, she wasn't afraid of what came next. She didn't know what the future would hold, but as long as Ethan was by her side, she was ready to face it. She reached up, cupping his face in her hands, and pressed a soft kiss to his lips.